If you were anything like me when you were first starting out learning how to draw, you probably looked up and saw that there's a place called drawabox.com and the 250 box challenge and just started grinding away at it to try and learn perspective. What if I told you that there's actually some key things that you can learn along the way that'll take you from drawing stuff like this to things like this much, much faster? Let's get right into it. Hey, my name is Alex, aka Radio Runner on Instagram, and welcome to my channel where I try to help you guys learn how to become more effective artists. Today, I'm going to show you the key mechanics to rotating boxes in perspective. Once you learn this, you're going to unlock an entire new world of being able to draw whatever you want, however you want. If you've ever wondered how people like Kim Jong-gi or all those other artists that you admire do what they do, this is it. So if you like this video and you like what you see and you think that you get value from this, leave a like and subscribe below, guys. It really goes a long way to help me out. And before we get into it, let me know, do you guys have issues drawing boxes or rotating them in perspective? If you do, I'll try to take that into consideration about future videos going forward. But with that said, let's get right into it. We're gonna go on the presumption that you already know how to draw a box, and then we're just gonna get into drawing a box with 1 point perspective and showing you how you might rotate that mechanically. Here, you have a box imagined as being on a ground plane. If you were to take a box as a diamond and slowly rotate its position like you see in the diagram, so you can take those points and mirror them down into a projected plane in perspective. Once you do that, extrude lines upwards and you have a 1 point perspective box that has been rotated. And maybe you've seen this one before, so if you tried that same technique and put an ellipse inside of it, which we'll go over later, and you start with a box in the corner and rotate it along the center axis of that ellipse. If you try to take that and project it into perspective, you can rotate your box on that ellipse's axis like this. There's only one problem though. No one does this. Instead, I'm going to show you the key thing that you should keep in mind when you try to rotate a box, and that's knowing where your vanishing points are. If a vanishing point defines where the edges of an object go into space, you can use that logic to say, well, if I want the edges to go in a different direction, I'll need to move the vanishing points along the horizon line. So in this example, you can see a basic 2-point perspective. If I rotate the vanishing points along the horizon line and put them to the right, it'll actually change the orientation of that box. This is the basics of rotation. If we try to implement that into 3-point perspective, just so you can see what happens, it rotates the box forward. So now you technically have a vertical plane and you can rotate things along that axis as well. Wherever you put a vanishing point, that defines the edges and you can rotate accordingly. So let's try this again. We've got basic boxes in 1-point perspective. But now let's say, hey, I want to rotate a box, throw it in here. Well, we can actually put a 2-point perspective box into a 1-point perspective grid. You're not limited to just 1 point if you're working in 1-point perspective. And the same goes for the other modes of perspective too. By me putting 2 points and defining a different object to it, I now have that box rotated on the same plane. And you can see I do the same thing with another box, and I even introduce a third one that's in 3-point perspective. So let's take a little look at what's going on here. If we try to keep a box in the same point and it starts off in 1-point perspective, you're just going to see it head on. But let's say we want to rotate it just a little bit and take that point that's in the middle of the box and move it to the right. If you have those horizontal lines that are parallel with the horizon line, what happens to that vanishing point? Because those are going to another point, it's just infinite. If you suddenly start to close that off and they have to converge somewhere, it's reasonable to deduce that it's going to converge very slightly. So you can see I introduce a second point way off to the horizon with minimal convergence. If you rotate it a little more, you're going to see that the original vanishing point has now shifted farther to the right, and the one that was way off the page is now closer and on the canvas. You can keep doing that, and you're going to end up with the original point being way off the canvas, and the one that was far away is now closer, and we've almost made a full rotation. Notice how the plane that I've highlighted with a gray value starts being wide from face on, and it gets more and more narrow the further it turns away from us. You can see the inverse happening on the opposite side, so this can be a shorthand for you when you learn to rotate. Just memorize that when you rotate a box, one face is going to get smaller while the other one is going to get larger. One of the best ways to practice this method is to start with a rotation grid. This exercise is really good for testing you putting your original rotation key points and filling in how they would be combined together. It's a challenging exercise, so you can see me work through it. I'm trying to maintain the corners and the edges at the same point, while imagining the convergence that I'm taking from the left column in the top row. This is essentially showing a shift in camera angle. You can imagine that we're starting looking at the box head on and moving the camera upwards on top of it or moving it to the side. Another method of rotation is rotating on an axis. So here, I'm going to show that you can project a plane anywhere into perspective and imagine an ellipse inside of it. Still more to come on that later. And from the perpendicular line that you get from that axis, you can project a line anywhere on it within the axis of the ellipse and converge to another vanishing point in the distance. By doing this, you can maintain a rotation along a simple axis, kind of like what I showed you earlier, but you can do it anywhere and quickly. So imagine if you had an ellipse in perspective and you made the axis perpendicular and you defined vanishing points and made a box. If you wanted to make another box, you can just go back to that ellipse and define the points elsewhere, and then you've got a rotation. If you wanted to rotate that box on axis, just go back to the ellipse, put your lines somewhere else defining new vanishing points, and extrude all of your lines to those points. Voila! Now you've got a box rotated on axis. But here's the real kicker, guys. Here's how to understand the ellipses. Going off of that shorthand that we saw earlier, where you take the plane of the box and shift it more away from you, implying that it's turning away, if you put an ellipse in that box, so draw a circle and have it touch every edge, you can see how it gets more and more narrow. It's as if you were imagining a cup. If you look straight down at it, you're going to see right into it. But the more you turn away that cup, the more parallel that opening gets until you don't see it at all. You just see the cup instead. So if an ellipse is just a circle touching all the edges of a box, you can project that onto any plane. If you tried to make your own boxes in two-point perspective like this, and then projected your ellipses onto each face, you end up with a cylinder. Cool thing to know about a cylinder is that the side that is facing more away from you is always going to be more narrow, like that cup earlier. But the side that is more on the opposite end, it's farther away from you, is actually going to be wider in degree. So you can try this out for yourself. The side of the cup that you would actually be able to see is more narrow than the bottom side of the cup. But the key thing to remember about drawing cylinders is that the ellipse always has to be perfectly perpendicular to its minor axis. If you guys want to know a little bit more about that, I'll link you to a page on Drawbox that explains more in detail. If your ellipse isn't actually perpendicular to its minor axis, you end up with wonky cylinders. It doesn't work. Okay, so we understand that if you look directly at a cylinder, the wider its degree to the point that it can be a circle. And the less head-on you see that, the more narrow that cylinder gets. With this shorthand, you can give depth to anything extremely fast. And this is how I work to rotate objects in perspective like figures when I don't want to be dealing with boxes all of the time. In this short demo, I draw a couple mannequins and I show that you can pose them with just a stick figure. But in order to give depth to them, I draw ellipses that define their orientation in space. When I want to see more of an arm coming towards me, I draw a larger degree ellipse on that arm. When this figure's leg is kicking the other one, you can see that the degree of the ellipse is much more narrow. It's less of a circle and more like an oval. This implies that you're seeing less of it head-on and more of its side. Thanks to this shorthand, I have a basic constructed mannequin that I didn't have to think about very hard when making. And if you stick around to see what you can really do with that, you can use that base mannequin to define your orientation, rotate anything in perspective with those foundational rules, and use that as a base for a more advanced figure. Here I go back in and redefine my gesture and establish what these characters are. I changed the pose because I didn't like it too much, and go on to keep detailing them. But hey, let's take this a step further. I didn't like that they didn't have a background, so I define a one-point perspective on a horizon line and start to make things up. I thought maybe they could be fighting on some sort of stage, and then said, hey, what if they're fighting in a dojo? If you guys are interested in seeing my full painting process, I can try to make some videos in the future going over that specifically. Just leave a comment below and let me know if you want to see that. I found that the composition wasn't really working for me on that side, so I flipped the background and let that light do some of that work, guiding the eye from the guy who's getting hit. So if you enjoyed this video, you'll probably like what I've got in store coming in the future. I'm going to go over my curriculum and how to learn more effectively, as well as fill in the gaps and key places that I found aren't really covered in some online education. If you're curious to know what those gaps are, just subscribe and stay in tune for what I've got coming. The cool thing about all this is that learning this stuff isn't impossible. You can get to something like this point in as little as a year or year and a half. It just takes learning the right stuff. And for that, I've made a curriculum that collects all of the other resources on YouTube and makes it into your own personal art school so you can learn things step by step in order to get to this point. If you want to get a dialogue started with me, you can go ahead and leave a comment below or join my Discord server where people are studying the curriculum and sharing their work in there. I always do my best to answer things and help people along the way. That's how I've gotten to where I am now, and I think it's one of the best ways to learn. And that's it for me, guys. Just stay tuned because there's more to come. Alright, peace.